wish I was in the land of cotton wool, and there I not forgot to look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixie's land where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixie's land I'll take my stand and live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie.
We are here to help the Vietnamese because inside every gook there's an American trying to get out. And that's the way Floyd feels about most other people in the world. Everybody should think and act and talk just like he does. He also believes that the U.S. Constitution was divinely inspired and that all would be well if we would only follow it correctly. Although he does admit from time to time that it may need an amendment to clarify certain things. So much for divine inspiration, I guess, but Floyd can't be bothered with such logical observations. He may occasionally piss and moan about this or that the government is doing, but when the striped, star-spangled rag goes up the pole, in predictable Pavlovian fashion, he places his hand over his heart. He sheds a patriotic tear and reminds himself that America is still the best place on earth. Now this leads us to one of Floyd's other characteristics, and that is his adherence to the civic religion of Americanity, which is basically idolatry. Oh, it has all the trappings of Christianity, but at its heart is not the praise and worship of the triune God, but the centralized secular state. Like its unholy predecessor, abolitionism, it uses Christian syntax and imagery, but its doctrine does not teach peace and salvation. No, its doctrine is war and death. The state has corrupted true religion to its own purposes. It has placed itself at the center of all life, public and private, while pushing Christ and his gospel to the periphery. Americans now look to the state for succor and salvation instead of Christ. And sadly, the average pew warmer, along with his pastor, has gone over to the other side without even realizing it. On flagpoles in front of almost every church flies a U.S. flag. Sometimes it flies above the Christian flag. You will also find it inside the sanctuary, in the position of honor and superiority as federal law requires. And on or near July the 4th, you will be subjected to entire services being given over to the singing of patriotic songs like the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, Floyd is also committed to the proposition that all men are created equal, and that anyone from anywhere can be an American. Never mind that up until the middle of the 20th century or so, no other American ever believed that. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution declares that the new government was being established to secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and their posterity. Now, what kind of people, I reckon, would that be talking about? Folks that look like you and me, or just anybody from anywhere. And up until 1965, U.S. immigration law limited naturalization to free white people of good moral character who had lived here for several years and could be vouched for by employers and neighbors. Now, doesn't this necessarily imply a certain racial component that one must possess in order to be an American? Not anymore. An American is any nondescript human being over which the U.S. government can claim a taxing power. A few of Floyd's other attributes are that he is a mindless consumer of cheap foreign stuff, most of which he doesn't need, and all of which keeps him perpetually in debt. He's also a mass consumer of the debauched entertainment that comes from Hollywood and New York, complete with its positive portrayals of the joys and virtues of sodomy, miscegenation, smart aleck disrespectful kids, and idiot parents, and of course its obligatory negative portrayals of all things white, Southern, and Christian. And last but not least, he supports the troops and law enforcement unconditionally and is always willing to sacrifice himself or one of his children on the altar of American imperialism. To sum up, Floyd is a flag-waving, swamp-draining, compliant, super patriot. Don't be like Floyd. Now, what about our typical Southerner? Well, for the typical Southerner, I chose the name Johnny Reb. And Johnny Reb's stick figure would have a U.S. flag in one hand, a Confederate flag in the other, and an AR-15 slung over his shoulder. His scientific name is Meridianus Confusus Mentis, which means a Southerner who's mentally confused. Now, his range and defining characteristics are as follows. His range is just about everywhere below the Mason-Dixon line and above the Gulf of Mexico, west of the Atlantic Ocean and east of the western border of Texas, although he can be found in other parts of the continental United States. He's a little harder to find than Floyd the flag waver, but he doesn't show much resistance to silencing, and he doesn't give much resistance to silencing or eradication techniques. His defining characteristic is also his mindset and worldview. And just as the classical man, or just as Floyd, Johnny was described by Richard Weaver as a classical man. And that description goes as follows. The classical man knows nothing of infinite progression, but rather loves fixed limits in all things. He rejects the idea of ceaseless becoming in favor of simple, accepted, statuesque becomeness. He sees little point in restless striving, but desires a permanent settlement, a coming to terms with nature, a recognition of what it is in its self-sustaining form, a world of coexistent individual things. He is tolerant as a matter of course. Other things are because they have to be. He marks their nature and limits and learns how to get along with them. His kind of tolerance is expressed in his easygoing ways and his willingness to let things grow where they sprout. He accepts the irremediability of a certain amount of evil and tries to fence it around instead of trying to stamp it out and thereby spread it. His is an acknowledgement of tragedy and the limits of power. Now, poor Johnny also thinks that the United States is a great, free, and prosperous country, but he's not totally convinced of its perpetuity. He believes that the U.S. Constitution is a good document, but he's studied enough history to know that it could be improved upon, just as his Confederate ancestors did when they sought their independence in the 1860s. He often complains of the degradations and oppressions of the U.S. government, but like Floyd, when the striped star-spangled rag goes up the pole, he also places his hand over his heart and pledges allegiance, and is grateful that America is still the best place on earth in spite of all of its troubles. He even gets angry when the Zulus, who perform in the National Football League, refuse to stand and give honor to the Yankee flag and national song. Now, this comes from a guy who probably salutes the Confederate flag and cause with affection, reverence, and undying devotion. Johnny is confused. And while he may flirt with the idea of secession and independence, he will always fall back to the position that the empire can be reformed, and that he's okay with keeping the Union together as long as he, the red-headed stepchild of that Union, can have a place at the table, and those agitators will leave his flags and monuments alone. Johnny's religion is also tainted with Americanity, although he'll deny it. In his mind, he's much more orthodox. After all, we're in the Bible Belt, right? Yet, his church has a U.S. flag in front of it, or above it, or in it somewhere. And on 4th of July, they'll be singing patriotic songs. So just how orthodox are they in reality? Especially when their pastors and they seem to accept homosexuality, bend over backwards to apologize for slavery, a sin none of them committed or any of their so-called apologists ever endured, by the way, if it's a sin at all, condemn the Confederate flag, praise charlatans like Martin Luther King, countenance abortion, adultery, and so on. You know, the Southern Baptist Convention recently condemned all things Southern and Confederate. Came out against the display of the Confederate battle flag. Presbyterians and Episcopalians and other denominations have been ordaining, quote unquote, homosexuals for quite some time now. So it certainly calls into question the orthodoxy of Johnny and his fellow travelers. Now, one of Johnny's other characteristics is that he really enjoys playing dress up. He likes to put on a Confederate soldier's uniform, go do a little primitive camping on an occasional weekend, and revel in the, what's the right word I'm looking for here? The silliness of pretending to fight long ago battles that have already been lost and can never be won. And we all know these kind of types. The SCV is populated with them, and so is the UDC. They may talk much about the love of their Southern heritage, but they always have U.S. flags at their meetings. They pledge allegiance. At the end of the day, they're all happy to be good Americans. You know, they just can't figure out which side of the dang proverbial fence they want to be on. And I think part of the reason why they do that is because Johnny doesn't want to lose his respectable place in polite society. See, it's one thing to play dress up and go pretend that you're a soldier who fought a war a century and a half ago, and to talk about how many buttons are on the shell jacket of a Richmond coat, or the caliber of the ammunition that was used, and so on and so forth. You know, that's a respectable, harmless little hobby. But you go start breaching the veil of the indissoluble Union. You start questioning the Lincoln myth. You start saying that you think the Southern people would be better off as their own separate nation, distinct and separate from the horrible, evil United States of America, and all your friends and family start to look at you funny. You know, all of a sudden you don't get invited to the country club anymore. You might even lose your job. So Johnny's just a little too much of a coward to really be true to his Southern convictions, or at least what he claims are his Southern convictions. Now, he also is not too sure about this all men are created equal thing. You know, he looks around at the blacks, the Mexicans, the Asians, the Chinese, you name it, who are invading his Southern homeland. And he kind of scratches his head and he says, I know they're telling me that they're just, that they're Americans too and all this other kind of things, but, my personal experiences in life and those of my parents and my grandparents all tell me that they just ain't like us. They just ain't like us. But he doesn't want to lose that respectable place in polite society, so he can't go too far in criticizing the new vogue of miscegenation. So when it happens that his children decide to mate with and produce offspring with these various other racial groups, that he has to feign pride and happiness with his little mulatto grandchild sitting on his lap at the family picnic. When deep down inside, he's got to be wanting to tear his hair out like, how could they do this to me? How could they do this to our people? Like Floyd, he also likes to consume stuff. After all, Johnny likes his bass boat and his four-wheeler. And he definitely gets way too caught up in the National Collegiate Athletic Association football games and NASCAR and so on and so forth. He also expends volumes and volumes of hot air about how much he loves his guns. Thus the reason why Johnny's stick figure has an AR-15 on his back. But it seems like he's firmly against using his guns to defend against the usurpation and trampling of any and all of his rights except his right to own a gun. Johnny has stood by, like a lot of other Americans, and watched the government slowly take away our rights to free speech, our rights to assembly, our rights to our property, and just about anything else you can name. There's hardly anything that you can go do today that you don't have to get some government permission slip first. That's not freedom. As the character Fletcher said in The Outlaw Josie Wales to that Yankee senator who convinced him to betray his friends, "Don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining. I know better. Or at least I should." So maybe, finally, when the government decides that Johnny no longer has the right to own a gun, maybe then Johnny will actually use his gun to shoot the bastards when they come to take his guns away from him. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. And of course, Johnny still puts his kids in the public schools. Even though he laments and harps and moans about the amount of property taxes he has to pay to support them, and how awful that darn Common Core stuff is, how they're dumbing our kids down and they're teaching them about sodomy and teaching them about this and all, they're perverting their poor little minds and everything, but he still sends them there. And then he wonders why they grow up and turn against him. It should be obvious. Now occasionally he musters the resources necessary to put them in private schools, but by and large he rejects this goofy homeschooling idea because that's just way too much trouble. And I don't have a government issued teaching certificate, so obviously I'm not qualified to teach my kids how to read or write or do arithmetic. And besides, they won't get those wonderful social experiences that they get in the government schools, because they're squirreled away at home with mom and dad all the time. And of course, anybody who is actually involved in the homeschooling movement knows that that is a crock. Homeschool children are very well socialized. They do a lot of activities with other kids and do field trips and all kinds of other things. So it's just because they're afraid to step out of their comfort zone. Johnny just doesn't want to lose that respectable place in polite society. So to sum up, Johnny's confused. He's not sure whether he's an American or a Southerner. He loves the Confederate flag, but he still honors that U.S. flag. And he still does what the government tells him. So don't be like Johnny either. So the last alternative is that you have to be a Southern nationalist if we are going to achieve the independence and freedom of our country and our people. So what does a Southern nationalist look like? What would be his characteristics and traits? Well, I decided to call my Southern nationalist Conan the Confederate. And Conan's scientific name is Victor Barbarus, which means barbarian conqueror. His figure would be represented by him holding a Southern nationalist flag in one hand, a sword in the other, and his head adorned with a Spartan helmet, because Conan is a warrior. Conan, unlike Johnny, has no interest in fighting imaginary battles from long ago. Conan wants to go into the field and fight his enemies for real, today. He's not afraid to pick up his shield and go into battle and get his hands bloody with his blood or that of his enemies. He is a warrior for his people and his lands. He's not content with a place at the American table. He wants a place of his own that's exclusively his and that of his people, that will be ruled and governed according to his principles and his ideas and his worldview. He's not interested in the scraps from the master's table. He wants to be his own master. He wants his people to be their own master, to chart their own destiny among the family of nations. Conan is harder to find than Johnny, though. He's the rara avis, or the rare bird. You have to look hard to find Conan. You have to come to places like this. You have to join the League of the South. That's where you get to meet Conan. That's where you get to become Conan. It's where you have to become Conan. There's no room in the Southern nationalist movement for equivocation, compromise, or half measures. It's all or nothing. And as the outlaw Josie Wales told everybody that was holed up in that shack before they were attacked, it means you got to get plumb mad dog mean. Because if you give up, you neither live nor win. And that's just the way it is. So you have to ask yourself the question, do you want to give up? Or do you want to win and live as a free man? That's the question each and every one of us has to ask himself or herself. And once you make the choice, there's no turning back. There's no going home to the comfort of being Johnny Reb or Floyd the flag waver ever again. Because once you understand the truth of what we're doing and the noble cause that we are pursuing, it's like you've been in a dark room most of your life and somebody finally turned the light switch on. And once the light comes on, you never want to go back to the dark again. As Dr. Hill has said many times over the years, what the League is engaged in is serious business. And for those of you who've been following contemporary events for the last couple of years and have seen some of the things we've been up to and some of the things that have happened as a result of that, should know that all too well. So it's not an easy or a light choice to make. But it has to be made, one way or the other. You can't straddle the fence forever, because sooner or later, one of those little pointy fence boards is going to go someplace that's not very comfortable. So to sum up Conan, he's a warrior. He fights for his people. He fights for his beliefs. He fights for his land. Be like Conan. Thank you, and God save the South.